I also think starting with the, getting rid of kind of the term and concept in your language of who you're working with about a helicopter parent, and moving from, thinking about how do you manage parents to how do you really involve them and include them in what you're doing and engage them in supporting their students.
Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I am your host, Heather Shea. The week that this episode is being recorded has been designated as First Generation College Celebration Week. On or around November 8th each year, campuses acknowledge and elevate the identities and contributions of first generation college students. Building upon past episodes, today I'm bringing together a panel of scholars and college administrators whose research has paid particular attention to parents and families of first-gen students. Before I get to introducing my panel, let me tell you a little bit about our podcast. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope you'll find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays, and you can find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Today's episode is sponsored by Simplicity, a true partner. Simplicity supports all aspects of student life with technology platforms that empower institutions to make data-driven decisions. And this episode is also sponsored by Vector Solutions, formerly EverFi, the trusted partner for 2,000 plus colleges and universities. Vector Solutions is the standard of care for student safety, well-being, and inclusion. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast for more information about each of these sponsors. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Heather Shea. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am broadcasting from East Lansing, Michigan, on the campus of Michigan State University. MSU occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. And the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. I am so grateful to my colleagues and friends, Drs. Kathy Adams-Reister from IU Bloomington, Cassandra Harper from the University of Missouri, and Judy Marquez-Kiama from the University of Arizona, where we all used to work many years ago. So it's so great to be back in community with you all. Thank you for joining me for an episode of the podcast, and welcome. Let's begin by each of you telling us a little bit about you. What is your work, and how does your scholarship and research intersect with today's topic, first-gen parents and families? And Judy, I'm going to start with you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting us. And Heather, it's always so fun to be back on one of your episodes and shows and evolutions of all of the incredible work that you're doing. So thank you. I'm Judy Marquez-Kiama. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And as Heather mentioned, I'm at the University of Arizona, which is home to the Orem and the Yaqui tribal communities. I am in the current role of Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Development. This position is specific to our HSI designation, which is relatively new still to the University of Arizona. And I get to work with faculty across the institution in really considering how we support and build capacity around our research and scholarship, teaching and service in direct relation to our HSI designation and commitment. I am also a professor in the Center for the Study of Higher Education in the College of Education. And, my research has always been with families, in particular communities, and the ways in which families, Mexican families, low-income families, Pell-eligible families, Latino communities and families, first-generation college families, have worked to support their college-going children and developing college-going pathways and college knowledge within the home. And about 10 years ago, Cassandra and I decided to engage in a partnership in really building a research agenda around the college transition points and engagement of families as they move into and through post-secondary education with their children. So I'll pause there and we'll share more as we go through.
Great. Thanks so much, Judy. It's so great to see you. Cassandra, that seems like a good segue to you. Tell us a little bit about you, where you work and what you do in research.
Sure. I'm Cassandra Harper, and I use she, her, hers pronouns as well. I'm an associate professor of higher education at the University of Missouri, and my research agenda looks at the differential effects of college on students. And as Judy mentioned, we engaged in some research and some common interests around really combating this helicopter parent narrative that we saw within our student affairs experience and backgrounds, and wanted to challenge that and kind of shift the narrative to the many ways in which parents are engaged in the college experience of their children, and perhaps in ways that go unseen sometimes by college and university faculty and staff. And so it's been a great partnership, and we have some ideas in the pipeline for upcoming projects related to that. But that's kind of my interest in parent and family engagement.
Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you. And Kathy Adams-Reister, welcome back to the podcast. This might be your third or maybe fourth time because I keep coming back to Kathy. Welcome back.
Thank you, Heather. I'm excited to be back with you all, and especially excited also to be here with Judy and Cassandra. As Heather said, I'm Kathy Adams-Reister. I use she, her, and her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Vice Provost and Executive Associate Dean of Students at Indiana University in Bloomington, where I oversee student service areas in the Division of Student Affairs, including our Parent Advisory Board and our Parent and Family Programs here at IU. Previous to this role, which I've only been in for just about 4 years, I was at the University of Arizona, and in my role there, I work really closely overseeing parent and family programs at the University of Arizona. And I was fortunate enough while I was there in 2015 to actually do some collaborating on an ASH monograph with Judy and Cassandra as a practitioner around parent and family engagement. And then additionally, I also was working during that time also on my dissertation, which actually looked at how families of first generation college students experience a transition with their students from high school to college. So I did some qualitative research in that area as well. I also want to acknowledge that Indiana University sits on the ancestral homelands, indigenous resources, and I want to acknowledge and recognize the Miami, Delaware, and Potawatomi and Shawnee peoples as past, present, and future caretakers of the land that I am coming to you from.
Thank you to all three of you. This is going to be a fabulous conversation, and I love how paths have overlapped and intersected over time. And so I think that we have lots to build upon. Hopefully, we can do this in the amount of time that we have allotted. If not, we'll just have to have a part 2 to this conversation. Because we are kind of complicating this notion, right, of parent and family, and really thinking about it through the lens of first-gen students. And Judy, as I mentioned in the introduction, this week was designated as a celebration for first-gen students back in 2017. Before we get to talking about their parents and families, maybe we could spend just a moment talking about who are first-gen students and why is an acknowledgement of their identities and accomplishments, achievements important to higher education. So we'll start with that.
Yeah, we had our first gen cats unit do a little bit of celebrating yesterday as well, and I saw a lot of people walking around with their first gen cats t-shirts. And last year had the opportunity to talk with some of the students and their families. They brought some of their families and shared my own path as a first generation college student and the wrong turns that I took even during that first week of coming to campus. But also shared the number of people and resources and the fierce commitment behind my own first generation college story, and that we see of our students and their parents and families. And so when we consider who first generation college students are, there's a multitude of definitions, but Cassandra and I draw largely on the definition that the U.S. Department of Education uses, and that's, we see it with TRIO programs and Gear Up programs and others, and that is that parents did not complete a 4-year college or university degree, regardless of other family members' degree completion. So it might be that a sibling has completed a 4-year degree, but the parent or guardian has not. So that typically is the definition that we will draw from in our own scholarship and research. And I think in some places we might see people pushing this as a proxy for race, ethnicity, or other identifiers, and we can't do that, right? I mean, yes, there's different intersecting elements of our identities, and some of our first generation college students also belong to minoritized or underserved racial and ethnic communities, or are Pell eligible, or are, fill in the blank with multiple identities. But we can't ever substitute or swap them as proxies for one another. But I do, I think, I'm so grateful that our institutions are recognizing who not only our students are as first-gen students, but faculty and staff too. But there's such a connection that can be made when you know that somebody has gone through the same path, and that there's possibilities, and people who you can turn to for questions. I think our institutions are doing a better job of collecting that data from the very beginning, whereas before on college applications, we didn't even know who might have identified as first-generation college students. And it's very helpful for us when we consider the role that parents and families play, and how to approach engagement with parents and families from an asset-based lens. So that's, I think, a good place for me to pause.
That is a great place to transition, because I do want to talk, Kathy, maybe you can share a little bit about how some of these common notions of how parents are perceived and assumptions that institutions make about the role that they play in their incoming students' lives. How are these damaging, and in what ways are these assumptions potentially keeping campuses from serving the full range of incoming students and their families? So I'll let you kind of go there.
Sure. So I think one of the challenges that we see is that campuses often make the assumption that parents are someone that need to be managed, or people that need to be managed. And with that type of viewpoint, I think it's pretty limiting in the types of interactions, because I think that has us say, oh, we want to keep them at arm's length. It's not necessarily the open, let's involve everyone who can support a student in student success, and how we can support their student success. I think we also have seen that campuses have a viewpoint that a very restricted viewpoint that parents are the only supporters of students, when we know that multiple other people support students besides parents, and just labeling the supporter as a parent might be a misnomer for a particular student in their relationship. So I think we need to open our concepts there. And I think we also, when we look at the term helicopter parent, that was originally coined by the media, when we look at that term and the way that campuses have employed it and used it, it also goes back to the how do we manage parents, how do we keep them at a distance, and it's really damaging, because really on campuses that term has also come often in the research, it really relates to upper middle class, often white families, who are only one small subset of the parents and families that we have supporting students. And it really often doesn't apply. Those types of behaviors don't apply, especially to families of first generation college students. And so we're taking one viewpoint and labeling all parents perhaps as that viewpoint. And then it doesn't let us see the nuances of different types of support and different ways we can help really move from engaging to helping to engage parents and families in different ways to help support their students as resources.
That's great. What would the rest of you add? I mean, now we've unpacked a little bit about who first-gen students are and why acknowledging their accomplishments is important, as well as who parents and families are and the assumptions that institutions make. What else would you add about kind of why this topic is relevant and important?
I think I would add that first-gen parents, because they might be less seen on a college or university campus, we might have assumptions about them that are incorrect, and that they really do want welcoming outreach, connection with institutions. And so being able to, again, kind of challenge that helicopter parent narrative can be really helpful. And then what you said about the celebration part, I think that's so important too, that there's a sense of pride that first generation could be seen as a label that has a sense of pride and community to it, that you're not the only one. And that there's a variety of families that exist and could meet each other maybe and support each other. I think is really encouraging.
Yeah, one of the things I thought about when, well, both Kathy and Cassandra mentioned the helicopter parent notion, media has been so perpetuated so many deficit definitions and framings and views of who parents and families are, particularly first-gen parents and families. And I remember as Cassandra and I were first starting some of this work, there was one media article that talked about parents viewing and watching their kids from a space station as if it presented this like image of they were just so far removed and so far away and they had no idea what was going on, in a different world, right? And that's kind of the image that it invoked. And then there was another one that talked about parents just sending their kids off, having to then like earn money to like solve all the family's problems. And there was just so such negative language around expectations of the students and then the role that the families would play. And it really prompted us to go deeper in thinking about the ways in which families could be engaged, but also the knowledge that they bring. It may not be the step-by-step college knowledge that we would see from a family who has gone to college for generations, but there's so much cultural and historical and community knowledge shared, and we shouldn't dismiss it, and certainly shouldn't perpetuate the deficit notions that we were seeing in media.
The other common thing I'm kind of noticing from all of these analogies is that it's about distance and it's about keeping parents separate and families separated from the campus and from their students, which if we count that notion and really kind of recast parents as partners, parents and families as essential components of our student success initiatives, I think we can really accomplish a lot more, right? Versus like, we're just going to put you up in outer space, or we're going to depict that kind of hovering over, but not really engaging with mindset. So, Cassandra, I think one of the particular points in time is that transition moment, right? So how and what role do parents and families play at that point when students are coming into a campus environment for the first time? And so, talk a little bit more about how we avoid falling into this deficit mindset that, parents and families have not, haven't given their students the tools. Talk a little bit more about the assets that first gen students and parents and families bring.
Yeah, I think our data really have spoken to the fact that parents are involved, they're invested, they're engaged. First gen parents are thrilled, they're excited for, their kids. But I use that term intentionally to describe how parents are describing their kids. They're not students, they're kids.
Yeah.
That there's a sense of, pride, celebration. They want their students to do well and to be successful. But that transition time really is a time of change for both the student and the parents. So there's a role shift there of adjusting to something that's new and different, right? And what does that look like? And what we've seen is that first gen parents are supporting their students emotionally, sometimes financially, just a variety of forms of support. And again, that's different than that narrative of first gen parents, and that they might not be attending all of the same events or at the same frequency. We have to think about, again, that just access to programming, but through that transition, I think parents have expressed that they really want their kids to grow and to become more independent. And that's a commonality there that parents and student affairs has, in alignment, that we both want that. And so how do we, as you said, partner with parents and bring them into that conversation? And I think that's the conversation that we need to continue to have within student affairs. It's a shift for us of, okay, what would this look like if we do invite parents into the conversation? And what does too much support look like? What is too little? What is helpful? What is excessive? So I think there's more work to be done there, but to know that parents and staff want the same thing, I think is helpful to keep in mind.
Kathy, I know you looked at this in detail in your dissertation in terms of what supportive members of a campus community and of a parent and family organization is. Can you talk a little bit more about what specifically that transition point? What did you find that parents and families contributed during that time period?
Sure. So and Cassandra mentioned some of this. So the families were often, and I'm going to use the term family a little bit loosely because in the interviews that I did, so it wasn't just a parent. So sometimes it was a sister, a brother, a cousin, a grandparent, a boyfriend, girlfriend, so a partner. So there were multiple different types of supporters when I asked students to identify who they got their most support from, and it wasn't just a parent. So I think that's one of the things I think to keep in mind of who is supporting our students. And they also had pretty deep relationship networks that they had created for themselves to help kind of with other types of support through the process. But as part of that, so they were, they had emotional support from their family member. They had sometimes they often had religious support, which was part of kind of their family foundation. As part of that, they had financial resource support, as well as sometimes care packages. Even some points where different family members or part of the relationship would help with editing papers. I had a grandparent who was really great with business, who was helping with business homework. So I think that there are multiple ways that families are drawing upon their knowledge and their community knowledge, as Judy said, to help support the student's success in college. And a lot of it was just the regular check-ins of how are you doing? How can I help you? Remember when you get stressed, like here are some things that are helpful for that. So they are employing lots of strategies. I think the challenge is thinking about the strategies that they're employing are really not visible to those of us working on campus and campus jobs. So I talk a lot about invisible strategies that are being employed that are often behind the scenes. So you're not really seeing that support that's being offered to that student. So it's not necessarily, and I think when we think we need to shift a little bit what our model of support looks like. So if we consider parent involvement to be a parent showing up on campus for an activity to support their student, that's really not often, and that will happen a little bit, but that's not what we're seeing with first generation college students. But if we shift our model to think about parent engagement and how are they engaging with their student and with the institution, that then starts to capture some of the more invisible strategies that we're seeing, and then looking at how do we make those strategies more visible and help connect. Parents they were able in some cases to know that there were resources and suggest to their student, have you talked to your professor? Have you talked to, do you need a tutor? So those things are happening. They're just not visible to us on campus.
That's great. I think the key here is that I keep hearing over and over is engagement, right? And Judy, you and Cassandra developed a model that talks about all of the dimensions of parent and family engagement. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that model, and we'll provide some links in the show notes that will help people kind of both visualize as well as learn more if they're interested.
Yeah, and it built so much on what Kathy just said. And it also was a way for us to capture in writing and through the development of a visual and a model itself, the ways in which we can combat all these deficit notions that we talked about, right? And so it is. I'm gonna look at the name so I don't mess it up. It's the model of parent and family characteristics, engagement, and support. And what we really tried to do was capture all of the different elements that influence, contribute to engagement of parents and families with their college age children as they make those decisions about college, transition in, and then continue that engagement in college. And so there are elements around family and community, like we've been talking about, different college characteristics, institutional context, of course, which we've talked a little about, pre-college characteristics, but then within the notion that you are constantly also engaging with things like your own self-efficacy and independence development, like Cassandra mentioned, educational aspirations that are not just pre-college aspirations, but aspirations that shift as you learn about yourself and your interests and your professional path, the social networks that students are connected to pre-college and within, the different involvement and engagement that students and families participate in, various dimensions of support. And we leave that broad because, like Kathy mentioned, family is not bound by a household. They're not bound by these nuclear definitions that we've seen. In fact, some of the students, that we learn more about are coming in without these quote unquote traditional definitions of family altogether. They may be former foster youth. They may be independent students. They may be bringing support people with them who are part of their kinship network. So these elements and factors are all interconnected. And then, of course, the family characteristics themselves. We were purposeful not to present this in a stepwise or hierarchical kind of fashion, because there is no maybe temporal order to them. These are things that students are engaging with throughout their time as a student, and we want them to. So that was the other maybe intentional element of how we developed this, is we don't want there to have to be that separation from parents and families. We don't want it to feel distanced. We want it to look like, in terms of a visual, but then also as we engage the model, we want it to appear that that parent and family engagement is as important now in post-secondary settings as we stress it in K-12, right? So that was maybe the impetus behind it and how it came to be. We drew quite a bit on some of the maybe cultural asset framing K-12 models of parent-family engagement, the ways in which we consider collectivist orientations of engaging with parents and families, and now are trying to, as we go through and do additional analysis on our own studies and data, maybe zero in a little bit more on some of these factors to learn more about independence, or to learn more about like the role of the institution, the assumptions of the institution, the communication patterns by the institution, so we can build out these different factors within.
So when I think about this model, and I think I mentioned before we started recording that Michigan State University has just recently established the Parent and Family Program Office. And so, making actionable plans around a model like this, I think, is one way that it could be kind of actualized, right? So can you talk about some of the recommendations that might actually translate into either institutional actions or individual unit actions, or recommendations for student success kind of initiatives?
Cassandra, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to keep? I have my list. You want to keep?
Go for it, and I'll follow up if needed.
Okay, and this has come not only from the development of the model itself, but the research that Cassandra and I, along with our incredible grad students in the last 10 years that they've been doing, have now published on their own, and Kathy's work. But things like considering different formats for engagement, right? And I think the pandemic has pushed us all to really rethink this altogether. But the fact that not everything has to be in person, that we can utilize virtual formats, that there's a lot that we can do even with our phones by ways of engagement with parents and families. Don't dismiss parents and families as problematic. And Kathy mentioned this at the beginning. People or problems to manage, right? I think we've got to just move away from that whole notion altogether. considering the cost, of course, of what engagement might be. And this is, I think, really specific to perhaps multi-day events, whether that's orientation or family weekend events or whatever it might be, pre-college events. You know, there are situations in which families cannot take the time off, or they cannot afford to pay the cost of having multiple family members attend an event for multiple days. So again, I think it goes back to how do we consider different formats and make them as accessible and inclusive as possible. And then having resources available after, doing what you're doing today, recording things and having it accessible after for people to view. And then a big one that came up with a lot of our work is making sure that services are offered in multiple languages and really getting to know who families are and the languages that they are using in their homes. And so if there's not simultaneous presentations available in multiple languages, making sure that there's translation or interpretation services offered. So we have a list, but keep going, Cassandra. I'm sure I missed some.
No, that was really good. I was just going to say, I think, common in what we found and what our focus is that we can't let the responsibility be only on the families, right? So what can institutions do to reach out earlier, maybe even pre-college, or how do we build relationships more intentionally? One thing that we heard from first-gen parents is that the authentic communication that they would get was really appreciated, the relationship building, but what they tended to see more often was fundraising or, calls for those sorts of things of donations. And so being able to build authentic relationships, because we found that first-gen parents might be less likely to reach out, but if they do build a relationship with someone, that's someone that they're going to return to. So for example, we had one participant whose student majored in engineering, met the advisor. The student changed their major, but for all future questions, the engineering major advisor was the person that they went to. So we can be strategic in that knowledge of who can we set up a meaningful connection with that the parent can kind of return to over time.
That is great. That is great. Well, as you were talking about those ranges of the model, I kept thinking about context and how different, and I think this is part of it too, right? Institution type and context. And I do think it does mean that our institutions bear some responsibility in understanding who their parent and families are, what kinds of supports might be needed. But like, what do we know about 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions, public, private? Cassandra, can you build on that a little bit, how context might adjust what the expectations are a bit?
I love this question because context does really matter. And so thinking about the students who are attracted to different institutions because they have different needs and they're looking for different things out of the higher education experience. So just as the students are different, their parents and their key supporters and that network is going to look really differently. So I think, I'm thinking about direct entry from high school students and, the range of students we have in that category. Some of those students have financial responsibilities for their families actually, or, might have a lot of support from parents and key supporters. And then think about returning adults who have work experience, families of their own. Maybe you're doing some parental care responsibilities. Those are really different populations. So partially my answer is, I think that context matters and that there's a lot there. I also think that we just don't fully know. I think we need more data and need to collect more data on the key supporters that students are turning to, because I think you're absolutely right that this would look very differently at these different campuses. And how do we know more about them? How do we connect with those key supporters? Can we get their contact information and permission to follow up and share information, and maybe even seek opportunities to allow family members and supporters to connect with each other.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And that's what I love about all these recommendations. I think they do provide really like key pieces for how do we create opportunities for engagement. So we've been talking kind of broadly, and Kathy, I'm going to drill down into very specific types of units for which all of this has implications. And so, you know, when you think about all the things that we've already discussed around parents and families, and particularly first-gen students, parents and families, you know, what are the implications for new student orientation, for parent and family program offices, for various student services units, student success initiatives, communications? I'll like throw like the broad list out there, and then you can kind of talk through, and we can kind of then go into a little bit more detail.
Sure. So I think Judy and Cassandra have just listed some really key things that I think you have to take into consideration on how you're building all of these programs. So when you look at new student orientation, how long is it? What is the cost? Are there alternatives? Is there a session that's, you know, adjacent to the beginning of the school year so that families aren't having to come twice and pay that expense twice? Depending on the background of the families and languages spoken at home, you know, are things provided in alternate languages so that families really are being able to understand, if English isn't their first language, the context of what's being shared in a session for parent and family. So I think looking at some of those things is really important when you think about new student orientation and how that's structured. And I think also one of the things that I think, regardless of what type of student we're talking about, if we're talking to parents and families, talking about that transition from high school to college is also super important, because I think we get all caught up on, oh, you're in college now and here's what college looks like. But I think sometimes helping connect the dots of high school is different and here it from college, and here are the differences, and spelling those out for any group that we're talking to, for families and supporters, is super important, because sometimes that connection isn't always made, and that helps them, I think, better support their students. I also think for parent and family programming offices, creating good connections across campus, because I don't know that there are a lot of places where parent and family programming and something like a first generation or first cats like University of Arizona has, that they're connected, and making those connections I think is super important, because then I think you can look at, you know, are there different populations and different types of needs and different ways to connect with different populations, so that you're really serving everyone and being inclusive in what you're doing. And I think if you follow kind of some of the traditional parent family programming models that are out there, you're probably missing kind of your level of being inclusive in that service. So I think being able to take a look at and really evaluating what you're doing, and are you being inclusive of all of the families that are part of the student groups, and making sure that if you're sharing, and this kind of goes to communication, but for parent and family programs, if you're sharing communication, you know, how are you doing that? What type of programming are you doing? And are there multiple formats of that programming? You know, is your really one big event come for family weekend, and then that's not super inclusive because not everyone can come for family weekend. So I think really looking at that lens of how inclusive is our programming, and are we sharing things in multiple types of formats and modalities, and perhaps multiple types of languages as well, that, you know, I know Judy talked a little bit about that. So I think all of those are important to think about. I think with student success initiatives, as we're looking at those, I think it makes sense to look at how our parent and family members partners in success, like you mentioned earlier, Heather, and how do we, you know, work on bringing them in to embrace and help support student success instead of trying to manage them. And I think that's such a different lens and philosophy. But I think if we're all working together, then I think ultimately we have more ability to support our students. So really looking at how are maybe parents and families part of our success strategy with how we're trying to support students as far as that goes.
That's super great. Judy or Cassandra, anything else you would add as far as repercussions for these very specific units or offices?
I think the financial aid piece is huge. Finances have come up over and over again. Of parents want more information, so there's really, you know, no limit there of additional communication. And then for communications offices, I think the work that Judy and I have done has spoken to the philosophy that we need to talk about of not only kind of the messages towards parents, but kind of what is our value and intentionality behind what we want to say and how do we want to say it. I think the data also showed that first-gen families want to be invited. And so there's a way of phrasing those sorts of invitations in a way that communicates that their presence is desired and needed. And that's slightly different maybe than how we're thinking about communications.
I love that. So my next question is really around advice and resources, and what should we be doing to kind of collectively as practitioners, as faculty, as grad students, what should we be doing to improve our understanding of and better serve first-gen students, as well as their parents and families? Judy, I'll start with you, and then we'll see what else everyone else will add.
Okay. I'll start maybe from like an umbrella institution perspective. One of the things that came up a number of times when we were talking to administrators or directors of parent and family offices is that there's just not enough resources to build out the intentional programming that they want to do. And that often parent and family offices get moved with whatever might be, I don't know, organizationally the fit at the moment, but not always the best intentional fit when we consider how to best then build this entire kind of intentional programming for parents, families, and their students. And so we saw a lot of different organizational models and a lot of different resource and funding models. We also talked to quite a few people who mentioned that they had a significant fundraising component to their jobs, which meant that whatever they were doing to serve parents and families, they had to raise the funds for. And so I guess one piece of advice was that if this is really important for our institutions, then institutions need to invest in the resources that these offices and departments need to then serve parents and families and engage them in intentional ways. The other piece that I think we could do better in terms of really understanding who our students are, who their parents and families are, is tap into institutional research and data. And if we're capturing who students are on their applications as first generation college students, then we can analyze and disaggregate, right, by different identifying factors. We can understand their college going paths a little bit more. We can see whatever institutional data is collected, right? There's ways to like pull it and analyze it and then use it to inform the work that we're doing. So those two pieces from an institutional perspective, and certainly as for those of us who are teaching and preparing graduate students, I think there's an element of that as well that I know you were going to ask Cassandra to talk about.
Yeah, Cassandra. That's perfect. Sandra, as a faculty member, what would you suggest?
No pressure. Just expanding that narrative. I think in our coursework, we can really make sure that we are questioning what assumptions do we have about parents, of today's college students. What images do you have in your mind? Who are you serving? Who do you think about? And then for programming, I think the data point is a great one to come back to too, of are we collecting data about who's participating, who isn't, and are we making conclusions about that? What could we be doing differently on the institutional side related to that? But I think, the involvement of parents and families is such a shift. So I think that should start in graduate school preparation programs to have those conversations early and often of, what would this look like? What are the logistical barriers? What are the FERPA needs that we need to look through? What are the considerations on campuses? But I think if campuses can see the benefit and the value, it's not an added task alone, but it's it's expanding our ability to reach students, to really enhance their student success, which Kathy's work, really speaks to. I think that could be a benefit and a rationale that we could use to get that additional support.
That's great. Kathy, I'm going to tweak this question just a little bit for you. So as a former director of a parent family office and as somebody who now supervises that office, what advice would you give to campuses that don't have this office that are thinking about starting one? Or what are the essential components that you think they should include?
So I would say that they need to do some looking as to kind of a little bit of program evaluation, what's out there, who are their students, who are their family members as part of that, what's the population they're going to be serving. And there's some decent data. I mean, I was able to do a lit review for my dissertation. So I know, there's information out there that you can look at. And I think there's some good recommendations about how to build more inclusive models for parent and family programming, and looking at what you build from the ground, how can it be inclusive from the beginning? And I think that would be the place to start, is how do you build that type of model of programming with how you're doing outreach and the type of programming that you're doing, and those kinds of things, I think would be where I'd start. I also think starting with the, getting rid of kind of the term and concept in your language of who you're working with about a helicopter parent, and moving from, thinking about how do you manage parents to how do you really involve them and include them in what you're doing and engage them in supporting their students. So I think going in with that philosophy, and hopefully, and I've worked in places where fundraising is a component of that office, but I think if it is, you also have to be super protective that the focus, if you really want to build an inclusive programming, it can't really also just be about fundraising. And there's a place for that, but you need to be able to have be able to think about them separately, I think, as part of that. And there's a place for the fundraising part too, but I think to build it inclusively, you need to have the ability just to have programs that don't cost and provide resources and supports that are a benefit and support to all, and not just because you're, donating money or you're involved or part of the association or things like that based on financial contribution. So I think that's where it gets a little tricky when fundraising is tied to the organization as part of what you're doing. So I think those would be some places to start. And I think there is some good information out there on, and what do you need to think about in building. I mean, Judy and Cassandra have done a lot of work in that area, and there's been some good things written. I think that you could start as a basis to look at.
That's great. That's perfect. Thank you. For my own campus's benefit, as well as other places that are thinking and are just really in the beginning stages of building these types of programs. So we're to the end, and we always run a little short on time. This podcast is called Student Affairs Now, and so we always kind of take a moment at the end to kind of summarize, what are you pondering, questioning, thinking about, excited about now? And if you would like to share how or where people can connect with you, that would be great. And so Kathy, we'll stay with you for final thoughts. What are you thinking about now?
So I am thinking about, I just think there's a lot more work and possibility in this area, especially as at Indiana, we're in throes of strategic planning and thinking about how do we, where's the role and possibility of engaging parents and family members as supporters as part of that, and trying to kind of, for me and the roles that I have in there, working that into some of the conversations about how do we do that and engage that as part of our student success area. So I think that's probably one of the big things. I also, for finding me, I'm at Indiana University in Bloomington. And I think I can provide maybe my bio, make sure my email address is there.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kathy. Cassandra, what about you?
Well, we're thinking about, I think, independence development, faculty and staff who have questions about how this might look and how their work might involve parents. I'm sure that there's some hesitation on the part of some. So I think continuing that research and application to practice will be important. And then Judy and I are collaborating on a book project and are looking for contributors. So this, I think what we've talked about today kind of highlights just how complex this is and how things might be shifting on campuses, and that people are doing really good work in this area, and we're looking for contributions related to case studies or discussion questions, or what this might look like on different campuses. So we'll put some information in the show notes, I believe, to connect that way, and then I can be found via email, and I think the information will be in the show notes there as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassandra. Judy, final thoughts.
Yeah, so check mark and echo, right, what Cassandra said, since we're working on this exciting book proposal together. We'd love to have folks contribute. I'm always, interested too in what parents and families have to say, and what is it that they need and want to see, particularly as we consider first generation college families, families of color, Pell eligible families, and especially coming out of the pandemic. I don't know that we fully know yet if families' needs have shifted, what that might look like, how we as institutions need to be responding to that and engaging them in ways that is shifting based on how their family situations may have changed because of the pandemic. So those are some of my thoughts. I will share my email and Twitter handle. I think that's what it's called. This is how tech savvy I am and social media savvy. Twitter and LinkedIn. So I'll share those after.
Great. Thank you all so much. I'm, as always, just grateful for your time and for the wisdom and sharing your contributions to the research and to this conversation. Also sending heartfelt appreciation to our dedicated producer, Nat Ambrosi. Thank you, Nat, for everything that you do. If you are listening today, not already receiving our weekly newsletter, you can visit our website and there'll be a pop-up in which you can enter your email, and then you'll receive an email every Wednesday with our newest episode. While you're there, you can check out our archives. I think we're at 127 episodes or something like this at this point, which is great. Just a little bit more about our sponsors for today. Thanks to our sponsors, how will your institutions rise to reach today's socially conscious generation? These students report commitment to safety, well-being, and inclusion as important as academic rigor when selecting a college. And it's time to reimagine the work of student affairs as an investment and not an expense. For over 20 years, Vector Solutions, which now includes the Campus Prevention Network, formerly EverFi, has been a partner of choice for 2,000 plus colleges, universities, and national organizations. With 9 efficacy studies behind their courses, you can trust and have full confidence that you're using the standard of care for student safety, well-being, and inclusion. Transform the future of your institution and the community you serve, and you can learn more at Vector Solutions. Our other sponsor today is Simplicity. Simplicity is the global leader in student services technology platforms with state-of-the-art technology that empowers institutions to make data-driven decisions specific to their goals. A true partner to the institution, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life, including but not limited to career services and development, student conduct and well-being, student success and accessibility services. Learn more by visiting simplicity.com or connect with them on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. You can take a moment to visit our website and click on the sponsors link to learn more as well about these and our other sponsors. Again, I'm Heather Shea. Thanks to our listeners, everybody who is watching today. Make it a great week, everyone.